Hello, a very warm good evening to all of you, and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to this special session where we shall be holding a marathon discussion associated with all the various different types of questions which have been asked in the mains examination for the subject of geography in the past 10 years. Now, when it comes to the mains examination, oftentimes as a candidate, we face an issue, we face a kind of a hindrance and an uncertainty, which areas to prepare for, which areas to focus upon, and how to create the answer, what should be the approach, and what should be the way in which we conclude the answer. So in this particular session we shall be discussing upon the key focus areas when it comes to various aspects of geography, not only analyzing the trends but also analyzing how to create the answer and which are the areas that we have to concentrate upon. Now, the PDF of the entire session shall be uploaded on the Telegram channel. The link is provided here. That shall be uploaded tomorrow. Now, having said that, for all of you who are interested in the platinum sessions and a one on one discussion thereby, tomorrow evening we are going to have a session at 7 p.m. for the basics of Indian geography. The link for that will be found in the description box below. And you can find a link about, and you can attend the session about the basics of Indian geography and gain the information thereby. Now, coming to the PYQ analysis and the PYQ discussion. Rather than classifying these previous year questions year by year, what we have done is we have classified the questions topic wise so that it is easier for you to approach these topics and it is easier for you to understand how to approach them and which areas to focus upon. So, first of all, we shall take a look at the questions appearing from the basics of geomorphology, then associated with climatology. After climatology, there itself, we shall take a look about the concepts and the questions associated with Indian monsoon. Oceanography, why do we say that UPSC has got minimal scope to ask questions in oceanography in terms of the complexity of questions? That is again something we'll take a look into. Climate change and water security. That is one of the key areas that UPSC is focusing upon. Within Indian geography, which areas to concentrate upon? Even though we might think that agriculture is something which is restricted to GS paper 3, there are certain questions which are asked year after year associated with the agroclimatic conditions of India. And then across the world, some of the questions which are based on the contemporary realities and the discussion associated with current affairs. So, thereby, urban issues, urban transportation, and the role of current affairs, which maps to reproduce, that is something that we are going to discuss upon. And you will see here that how UPSC, when it comes to the mains examination, is known for repeating the topics. Not only the exact topics for a particular module, but even in an indirect manner, directly or indirectly, they focus upon the same key areas. So, as a candidate, it makes your job easier. Now, first of all, starting with the topic and the module of geomorphology. Now, within geomorphology, basically UPSC has started looking into this area again after a gap of 2 to 3 years. Now, here you have a variety of topics ranging from interior of planet Earth to the magnetosphere to plate tectonics, continental drift theory, seafloor spreading theory, seismicity and volcanicity, as well as landforms. So, let us take a look at what kind of questions were asked and what could be our approach when it comes to answer writing. Now, even those of you who are attempting the examination Mumtaz for 2026 and beyond, this session will be helpful for you in order to understand how to write answers so that you can begin the practice of answer writing from today itself. And also, you can focus upon certain areas in particular to strengthen your note building for the mains preparation going ahead into the future as well. Now, here in 2024, associated with interior of Earth, a direct question was asked. Now, this was a question which was asked owing to its relevance in the current affairs. Current affairs. Now, that was because last year there was a substantial discussion about auroras, the kind of northern and southern lights, and the lights which illuminate the upper atmosphere. Now, these auroras, they were found to be or visible in even lower latitude. which was a departure from their normal phenomena of being sighted only in higher latitude. That is why this was an expected question out there. So let us take a look at this particular question. What are aurora australis and aurora borealis? How are these triggered? A simple, straightforward question. 10 marker question was asked. Now, what do you write in this particular answer and how do you frame the answer for? So, first of all, the content associated with this. That is where you need to have clarity of mind. So, aurora australis and aurora borealis, these are basically also referred to as auroras combined manner or northern and southern light. So, that is where you have to understand what these are: northern and southern lights. Okay. Now, other than that, how are they produced? So, that is the basic question. How are they triggered? So that is where, first of all, in the intro itself, you do need to mention the aspect of these auroras. So auroras are illumination in the upper atmosphere, which are produced owing to the interaction between the atmospheric particles like oxygen and nitrogen with the charged particles emitted by the sun in the form of solar flares and coronal mass ejection, right? So when that interaction with the charged particles happen, that is when you have these production of this light. So that is the basic fundamental. So in the introduction, when you have provided the definition of it, now that paves way for what you write in the body portion. In the body, you are expected, first of all, always advisable that between the intro and the body, when it comes to geography questions, always put the diagram in between the intro and the body part of the answer. The diagram should be inserted in between. Now, which diagram am I talking about which needs to be replicated here? So basically, here the diagram of magnetosphere is required. Magnetosphere of the planet. Now, when we say magnetosphere, what is required or what do we mean by that? That is basically planet Earth behaving like a magnet, what is geomagnetism, and the influence of that geomagnetism beyond the sphere of planet Earth, that is the magnetosphere. So, that is something that you have to depict with the help of a diagram. A simple diagram would do here of the magnetosphere. Now, once you do that, then you also have to indicate the emission of these charged particles from the sun, right? Now, then you have to indicate the interaction of these charged particles with the atmosphere. So, what do you write in the body? You talk about the role of interaction. Interaction between what? Interaction between oxygen and nitrogen molecules, as well as charged particles. Where do you get these charged particles? From the sun. How? In the form of solar winds and coronal mass ejection. After that, the process of it. How does the interaction produce light? So there you have to talk about that these charged particles will be resisted by the magnetosphere where the density of the magnetic field lines are less. Now these charged particles will try to penetrate the Earth's atmosphere where the density of the magnetic field lines, they are very high, and that is closer to the higher latitude. Now, in these regions of higher latitude, these charged particles, they provide the energy which knocks off electrons from the orbit of oxygen and nitrogen molecule. Eventually, after losing that energy, these electrons which have been knocked out of the orbit, they come back and return to the orbit. In this process, they end up producing light. So that process of electron leaving the orbit and recombining again, that produces various hues of coloration from green to purple to bluish hues. All of that needs to be discussed. And that will be the summarization. Now, how do you conclude such an answer? The direct question. Conclusion ideally is summarization. So how do you conclude such an answer? So the conclusion of it has to be simple. There, you talk about the influence of these charged particles in other parts of planet Earth as well. Basically, they can influence the uh, magnetosphere, or rather, by influencing the magnetic anomalies and magnetosphere, they will always have an influence even in the case of the compass reading. At the same time, they will have a disruption in terms of the power lines, the power electronics, communication systems, satellites can be knocked out and can be rendered ineffective, all of that. So that is why study of these auroras, they are not only visually appealing or picturesque, but at the same time relevant for our understanding of atmospheric behavior. So that is where the conclusion has to talk about the implications. Okay, I hope that is clear and no doubts prevail in this particular area, right? So here, this is the overall approach. For the first few questions, I will show you the approach as well. In the later questions, I don't think that will be required. So in the initial areas, what should be the approach? So introduction, what are auroras? They are basically the two types. That is the definition of auroras that you will write. Then also, they are generally observed or witnessed in the higher latitudes. In the northern hemisphere, they are known as aurora australis, and in the southern hemisphere, they are referred to as aurora borealis. Then comes the image of magnetos. Now, the body portion, reasons for formation of these auroras, role of solar winds, role of magnetosphere, interaction with the gaseous particles. There you have to mention oxygen and nitrogen particles. That is what interacts with them. And the production of light. That is the process of electron leaving the orbit and recombining again. That ends up producing light. Now, the conclusion, other impacts during such events which influence life when we talk about anthropogenic influences overall. Okay, so that is how you could have framed the answer. Even if it is required, or even if this kind of a question is asked for 250 words, there itself you have to elaborate upon the same lines. Now, is it relevant for this year or the next year? It is. But the same question won't be asked. What kind of question can be framed out of this is that there has been news which is going round for the past year almost, where researchers have found out that the outer core and the inner core, as they are rotating, there is a kind of a decoupling. Now, that induces a change in the magnetic behavior and also the change in the magnetic north and south pole. So, there can be a question which can be asked about what is geomagnetism. There can be a question asked about how geomagnetism will be impacted due to the movement of the outer core, decoupling of outer and inner core, where you need to know about the intricacies of Lehman discontinuity. So, that is the area that you need to focus upon. It is important even for this year and next year. Now, another question which was asked from the same topic, now that puzzled many of the candidates. Now, again, the question deals with the same topic, that is interior of Earth, the structure of Earth. But look how UPSC has framed it. How does the Juno mission of NASA help to understand the origin and evolution of planet Earth? Now, on the face of it, you might think that this is a question associated with space technology. This is a question associated with space missions. But the reality is that in this question, you talk about origin and evolution of Earth. Now, we have studied the various different phases of evolution of planet Earth. Now, evolution of planet Earth can be discussed by and can be understood by which theory? It is generally associated with the theory of accretion. Theory of accretion. Accretion basically refers to accumulation. So, that theory of accretion needs to be highlighted here. How? How do you highlight that? So basically, in this, first of all, you need to understand what is the content that UPSC is asking out of you. When we talk about Jupiter, Jupiter is the largest planet of our solar system and is also one of the protoplanets, which is expected to have been formed quite early, right? Sometime around the formation of planet Earth, and sometime, and in certain estimates, even prior to that. So, the formation of Jupiter and studying the layers of Jupiter gives you an idea about the early elemental presence in the solar system. Because if we are aware about the early elements which were abundant in the solar system, we would know that how planet Earth would have been created at the time of formation, which would be the elements which would be present in prominence during the time of formation. Because we have to understand, for those of us who are not aware about the theory of accretion, what is this theory of accretion? This is a simple theory which talks about the fact that at one point of time, when you had the formation or of the solar system, you had the presence of the sun, and around the region of the sun, you had large amount of dust particles which would be moving. Dust particles consisting of various different elements. Okay, various different elements. So these elements did combine to create and lead to the formation of planetesimals. Planetesimals. These are the building blocks of the planets. Now, multiple of these planetesimals then collided and converged together to form these protoplanets or early planets. Now, understanding the planets like Jupiter helps you understand the kind of process which would have been undertaken for the formation of planet Earth. But at the same time, when we talk about Jupiter, now Jupiter is a gas giant. It is a gaseous planet. As you move into the depth, the density increases, the type of gases also end up changing. So, studying the magnetic and the gravitational anomalies expected and experienced in different parts of Jupiter will give us an idea about the interior formation of Jupiter, interior layers of Jupiter. How does it help us understand the evolution of planet Earth? Because we know in the phase of evolution of planet Earth, when you had the proto Earth, which was a large molten ball of mass or a large molten sphere, so to say, after that, planet Earth went through a phase of stratification. That phase of stratification was basically when stratification means what? Arrangement in layers. So, planet Earth went through a phase of stratification where all the various different materials they were arranged in a layered format. So, understanding the layers of a gas giant helps you understand that how in the proto Earth this arrangement would have taken. More than that, when we talk about the gases which constitute the entire arc of Jupiter, now amongst the gases you also have the presence of hydrogen and helium. Now, hydrogen and helium, they were present in the early atmosphere across planet Earth as well. They were a part of the proto atmosphere, the primitive atmosphere, isn't it? But what happened? In case of planet Earth, this hydrogen and helium was stripped off by the solar winds, owing to the fact that the magnetosphere was still not very well established. But in the case of Jupiter, these gases, light gases, even though they might be very light, but they are still retained. Now, it is partly attributed to the gravitational pull of Jupiter, which is large, but there are certain areas which needs to be explored further. So that also helps you understand that evolution of atmosphere, why and how it would have taken place in the various phases across planet Earth. So like this, studying of Jupiter helps us understand the study of the interior of planet Earth. Okay? Now, can such a question be asked now? Now, such kind of questions can again be asked, but Jupiter won't be used. If it is directly used, it is a good day for you. You can simply reiterate and repeat this answer. But largely, the chances are that you have various different space missions, like the Chinese mission to explore the asteroids, right? Now, thereby, you have various missions being launched in order to explore Venus. So, those kind of planets and celestial objects might be used. That how and why the study of Venus or an asteroid helps us understand the interior and evolution of planet Earth. Now, there again, the answer and the content would be similar. Just that in the case of Venus, you will have to talk about that. Now, Venus is not a gas giant, Venus is a terrestrial planet. So, there you have to talk about frequent volcanism, production of heat from the interior, presence of multiple layers, molten materials inside, and the role of gases like CO2 in terms of atmospheric heat, elements, etc., those portions will remain consistent. Okay, but you can very well expect an area from or a question from this area as well. Now, introduction. In this, what was the Juno mission? That is to be included. Jupiter as a protoplanet, one of the earliest planet. So elemental presence is important. Presence of gases like hydrogen and helium. Conditions of proto-atmosphere in case of planet Earth. Study of gravitational and magnetic anomalies, the mineral distribution, gravitational fields. All of that will be helpful in understanding the interior structure and the layer of planet Earth. Well, now how do you conclude such an answer, even if it is asked now? So you talk about that these studies help us understand more about the interior and thereby have a predictability about the events on planet Earth. Hence, the need of the hour is to continue and to explore further in order to understand the formation of and the conditions prevalent in the early solar system. Okay, so that is the approach which is required in this particular question. So, overall, from the interior of planet Earth, these are the areas that you have to concentrate and focus upon. Formation of planet Earth. So, in this, the theory of accretion needs to be understood, right? After that, phases of evolution, right? What are the phases of evolution of planet Earth? The phase of stratification, then you have the giant impact leading to the creation of moon. So that giant impact hypothesis is also something which is required to be understood. Hypothesis, why exploration of moon is being paid greater attention to. Now after that, even when we talk about the phase of stratification, then after that you had the phase of cooling, where you had some amount of solidification, followed by the phase of torrential rainfall, and you also had the phase of degasification in between. Now that introduced new gases into the atmosphere. So simultaneously the evolution of atmosphere and the phases of atmospheric development also needs to be looked into. Geomagnetism as a concept is very, very relevant. The aspect of magnetic north and south pole. What is the concept of magnetic declination? That is the difference between the geographical north and the magnetic north pole. That is the declination. Interior structure of planet Earth. This is where the layers, right? Density of these layers and also discontinuity. Discontinuity. These are the regions that you need to focus on. Okay, I hope we are getting a clear picture. Now, then we come to the rest of the area of geomorphology. Now, earlier, what used to be the case is that in the entirety of geomorphology, focus was largely restricted to continental drift or the case of plate tectonics. Nowadays, for the past 4 to 5 years, UPSC has been diversifying it. So there, UPSC asks you to understand the geomorphic features on the surface and interlink it to the climatic conditions, or derive a question out of plate tectonics or continental. Okay. However, a question associated with an individual landform was also asked here. So let us take a look at some of these questions. Discuss the geophysical characteristics of the circum-Pacific zone or the Pacific Ring of Fire. Now, this is a question which UPSC has repeated. If you take a look at the past 20 years, UPSC has repeated this in the general studies portion at least thrice. And when it comes to the geography optional, there also UPSC has straightforward asked this question at least 2 to 3 times in the past decade itself. So, this is one of the pet areas for which you need to have a map that you will draw in the exam. Map is very important for this. Which map do you need to draw for this? The map of the Pacific Ocean and the region surrounding the Pacific. But don't forget to look at the ask of the question. The question is not asking you why or what happens at the circum-Pacific zone or the Pacific Ring of Fire. It is asking you the geophysical characteristic. So when you talk about geophysical characteristic, you have to talk about the formations or the features and also the events. Now, when we talk about features, so there you have to mention about the formation of trenches, volcanic mountains and fold mountains, right? So that is something which is associated in the entirety of the Pacific zone of or the circum-Pacific zone or the Pacific Ring of Fire. And here always provide example of these. Peru Chile Trench, then you have the case of Mariana Trench, Japan Trench, Kuril Trench, Tonga Trench. Do mention these examples. If possible, highlight that in the images. And when we talk about events, volcanicity, volcanicity, as well as seismicity. Okay? They need to be mentioned as well. So, how do you write the answer? In the intro, you straightforward talk about the circum-Pacific zone. What is this? So this is the region in the periphery of the Pacific Ocean, which is dotted with various different kind of geophysical events and activities like volcanism, as well as the presence of certain landforms like oceanic trenches, coastal fold mountains, as well as volcanic mountains. Now, that will be our intro and will pave the way for writing the body portion. There, you have to continue with the aspect that this is largely, or this can be explained with the theory of plate tectonics, whereby this is all a resultant of oceanic subduction. Thereby, the name of the plates which are undergoing subduction that needs to be put as example is so Nazca plate, South American plate, Pacific plate, Yuan de Fuca plate, and North American plate. Then the Pacific plate and the Caroline Sea plate, Pacific plate and the Australian plate, Pacific plate and the Amur plate, the sub part or the minor plate associated with the Eurasian plate. All these Pacific plate and the Philippine plate, all of these examples need to be provided. Okay. And then you draw this map also. Okay. Then you also have to mention in this the role of oceanic subduction. Now, when you talk about oceanic subduction, just talking and saying that oceanic subduction creates these landforms, that will never be sufficient. So, draw the schematic image associated here as well, whereby oceanic subduction you can highlight with a simple image talking about this. Okay, sea mounts, that is again a landform, then volcanic islands that will be found. So all these you talk about. Oceanic continental subduction also you mention, whereby you can elaborate Nazca plate and the South American plate, right? So all these examples can provide. Okay. Diagram in this is the map and the schematic representation. These two diagrams are required for this answer. There is no escaping the fact that you can omit one of these diagrams. If you provide the examples and pinpointed answer, it can be written within the word limit as well. Okay. So, introduction. What is the zone of the Ring of Fire or the Circum-Pacific Zone? That definition. You frame yourself. Please don't ratify and memorize these definitions. You should understand the concept so that you are able to reframe it on your own as well. Characteristics of the Ring of Fire. Please don't only mention seismicity and volcanicity. Every other candidate will mention this seismicity, volcanicity, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. They will give examples as well. But then you also have to mention about the features, right? These features because geophysical characteristic. If the question was, what are the properties? Again, the answer will be similar. If the question was, what are the events? Then you don't have to mention landform. But the same question can be reframed in multiple manner. Okay. Now, the reasons for this is where you have to talk about the oceanic subduction, oceanic, and oceanic continental. The Pacific plate being the older and the heavier plate is the one which undergoes subduction. How do you conclude this answer? What do you write in conclusion? It's a very technical question, so no way forward associated with this. So in this, the influence and the aspect about this being one of the dynamic regions of the planet, study and understanding of the events in this region helps us understand the internal functioning of planet Earth and decipher the interior of planet Earth. That can be one way to conclude. Other way to conclude is that understanding this helps us have again a foresight, a predictability of the events in the region which influences larger population and biodiversity in the region. Also, okay, I hope that is clear. Should we not write a CA angle like it was seen in Ladakh near the Hanle Dark Sky Reserve? In case of auroras, in case of space missions, there do include that in the portion immediately after introduction. Okay, don't frame your introduction based on current affairs event. You are not carrying out a 50-word news reportage. Please keep that in mind. So if even if you have to highlight the portion of current affairs, do that in the first part of the body and underline the phrase which you want to be highlighted. Okay. Now, anthropoints expect this. Yes, you can add that. Now, a question which was asked for landforms. Now, this is a departure from normalcy in the case of GS. In optional, UPSC has been asking questions about landforms, drainage systems in the individual capacity. But here, for the first time, after a long period of gap, UPSC has focused on an individual geomorphic landform. And that was a glacial landform which was asked. So, what are or how are the fjords formed? Why do they constitute some of the most picturesque areas of the Now, many of the candidates, they know the answer of the first one, but they don't know what to frame in the second part of the answer, that they end up representing the most picturesque areas of the world. So, how do you create an answer for this? What do you write in this? First of all, again, the general trend you would have caught intro is about the definition, right? Definition of fjords. Basically, the region or the landforms created as a consequence of glacial erosion, now where the seawater has entered inland, typically found in which regions? So, definition and regions where they are found. So, which regions do you find the presence of fjords? Across the higher latitude. In the regions like New Zealand, Norway, Norway has to be mentioned. Norway is a country known for its fjords. Okay, so in regions like Norway and New Zealand, Canada, parts of southern part of America, the Patagonian region. So there you can mention that. Now, after that, the formation process that follows the body. Before that, try to indicate a schematic. Draw the schematic. Schematic has to be very simple in the case of these fjords. So when you talk about the schematic of these fjords, it has to be as simple as possible. Okay, as simple as possible. So here, let's suppose you talk about somewhat like this, and then you talk about a kind of, yeah, right? And then here, inlet of sea. This simple schematic will be very sufficient. Okay. Very straightforward. 30-second or 45-second is what you have to take to draw the schematic. Now, in the body, you talk about the formation of these fjords. When did they happen? They were created during the ice ages. During the ice ages, the water level was low. The sea water level was low. Everything was frozen. Now, in the coastal areas, you had the glacial erosion. The glacial erosion led to the creation of U-shaped valleys. Now, these U-shaped valleys basically or eventually In the interglacial period, when the sea level rose and the ice melted, the seawater went inland, creating the water channel or water level which can have a depth of almost 1 to 2 kilometers in certain areas. In the case of fjord, you also mentioned that greater depth is found in the headward region of the mountain where the erosion would have been maximum, that is away from the coastline. And the depth can be slowly reducing as you come closer to the coastal area. So that entire formation process will require some explanation, some aspect of ice age and interglacial period. Thereafter, come to the second part. Why do they form the most picturesque areas of planet Earth? So basically, here you have to talk about the presence of mountains across the coastal area having heavily indented seawater inlet. The turquoise color of the seawater provides that pristine beauty or the natural beauty in the seawater. You can also find cold water corals, right? And the rich biodiversity in the coastal area or in these regions of fjords also provide a good visual appearance. That is what you have to talk about. Now, these mountain regions oftentimes are dotted with the glacial ice as well. So, you have the simultaneous presence of glacial ice, mountainous ecosystem, as well as the sea or the marine ecosystem, which provides a perfect combination. So, like that, you can elaborate. What do you write in the conclusion here? Conclusion has to talk about the anthropogenic aspect, that fjords across the planet or across the regions like Norway are the regions of population density where it is expected or estimated 90% of the population resides in these regions of fjords. They are important for fisheries, for biodiversity, and even for transportation and tourism. So, hence, these form vital areas even for anthropogenic scenario. Like that, you can conclude the answer. Okay. Now, introduction definition of fjords. They are long, narrow, deep inlets of the sea between stiff cliffs or steep slopes, typically found in glaciated regions. Body, the process of formation. Here, schematic image has to be brought. Schematic image. Glacial erosion, which happened during the ice ages, creation of U-shaped valleys, inlet for sea water. Why picturesque? Presence of deep valleys, clean water and glacial ice, simultaneous presence, corals and biodiversity. And in the conclusion, the aspect of population. Okay? Now, take a look at this particular question, a straightforward question, a simple question. Describe the characteristics and types of primary rock. Now, primary rocks refer to which kind of rocks here? What do we understand by primary rock? I hope in the case of rocks, we are aware about the three types of rocks that we have. We are aware about the rock cycle as well. That is the basic minimum that you need to be aware of. The classification also in terms of sedimentary rock, you have three types, that is clastic, chemical, as well as organic, right? And thereafter, even in organic, you have three other types, that is siliceous, carbonaceous, etc. Then in the portion of metamorphic, foliated, non-foliated, and also dependent upon how the metamorphism has happened. So thereby dynamic metamorphism, static metamorphism, hydrothermal metamorphism, that is something that you have to mention. In the case of igneous rocks, the classification, so primary rocks, they are none other than igneous rock. Igneous rock. Okay? Many of the candidates think primary rocks are all three types. No, only igneous rocks. Why? They were one of the first kind of rocks which were created, and the formation of metamorphic or sedimentary rock, in a way, can be initiated from the igneous rocks themselves. Hence, they are referred to as primary rock. They have led to the formation of other kinds of rocks as well. Now, after that, what are the types? So, the classification based upon the region where they are found. So, based upon the region, you have extrusive and intrusive rocks, right? Then, other than that, you also have to basically Not simply mention extrusive and intrusive. You have to give the properties of them as well. For example, crystal size or the grain size. So here, grain size is smaller. Why? Because of quick cooling, right? Here, larger grain size. Okay, that is something that you mentioned. Other than that, so based upon region of formation, this is one classification. Other than that, you have to talk about the case of the chemical on the basis of chemical mineral present, right? So mineral present. So on the basis of minerals, it is classified into felsic, mafic, as well as ultramafic. Okay, provide examples for each one of them as well. How do you conclude this answer? What do you write in the conclusion of this answer? If I can have some of the inputs from any of you. In these kind of questions, metamorphic rocks, sedimentary rocks, or the igneous rock, what do you write in the conclusion? A very technical answer is required. So, in this, the conclusion generally has to be about the economic utility of these kind of rocks. So, primary rocks being rich in mineral deposits, they are of great importance for economic viability for mineral extraction. Various different metallic minerals like iron, nickel, cobalt, etc., manganese, all of them can be found within these that you provide the conclusion. So, conclusion talks about economic significance. Okay, now that is how you approach it. Now, let us take a look at the various different areas being tried by UPSC where they are seeking a kind of interoperability from the side of candidates. That whether you are able to interlink multiple concepts or. So, take a look at this question. Briefly mention the alignment of major mountain ranges in the world and explain their impact on local weather conditions, right? With example. Which are primary rocks? Bahadur, primary rocks are igneous rocks, right? They are primary rocks. So, igneous rocks, their classification, that is basically primary rock. What are the various different types of igneous? Okay. Examples of those rocks and the aspect of rock cycle. Please keep that in mind. Now, briefly mention the alignment of major mountain ranges in the world and explain their impact on local weather conditions. So, here, what do you write in the intro here? A very interesting question. How do you frame the intro? So, intro in this will be very similar to what you write in the conclusion aspect, just that both of them should not be the same. So, intro, when you are writing this, should talk about the case where you basically talk about that across the entirety of planet Earth, you have the presence of various fold and volcanic mountains, which influence the life, biodiversity, and climatic conditions, thereby having a major impact on the planet. That will be your brief. After that, draw the diagram. Which diagram? This diagram. Now, you might not be able to reproduce all of these mountain systems, but at least the Rockies, Alps, Andes, Himalayas, Great Dividing Range in Australia, Atlas here, right? They need to be drawn. Rest of the areas can ignore. Ural also, it is very easy to draw. So draw the Ural also. Okay. But these major mountain systems need to be drawn. Now, earlier, that was in 2014, UPSC had asked a question that a similar question discuss or bring out the various fold mountain systems across the planet Earth and thereby explain seismicity and volcanicity across the various areas. But here it is asking about the influence on climate. So, how do they influence the climatic conditions? First of all, they basically influence rainfall, isn't it? In the case of Himalayas, they cause rainfall, orographic rainfall, right? In the case of Ural, however, they end up creating dry conditions on the leeward side. And that leeward side and the rain shadow zone, that also rain shadow zone, which is the example that you will give for rain shadow zone. In North America, always give the example around Colorado Plateau and the Great Basin. Colorado Plateau, right? Because Colorado Plateau is trapped between the Rockies and the coastal Cascade Range. So Colorado Plateau, Great Basin, that is what you talk about. Then influence on temperature. The Himalayas protect us from the cold winds coming from Siberia during the winter months, thereby keeping the temperature and the climatic conditions moderate in India, tolerable in India. But also, when you are mentioning about temperature, do mention about the reduction of temperature as you go higher up, but more importantly, about also impact of local winds. There are two local winds in particular that need to be highlighted in the context of the mountain systems and climatic conditions. Which are the two mountains that you can highlight? Uh, Sir, could we mention the Western Ghats in terms of rain? Are Western Ghats a mountain system? Shivansh, are Western Ghats a mountain system? First of all, be very clear in that. Western Ghats are not mountain systems. Western Ghats are escarpment. Okay? So you cannot mention or give the example of Western Ghats when it comes to role of mountains on climate. Okay? Keep that in mind. Now, which are the local winds that you have to present or use as an example? So there are two types of local winds that you can mention. First is the mountain and the valley breeze, or the anabatic and the katabatic. Anabatic and katabatic. And secondly, you also give example here of wind systems like Chinook. Chinook is experienced across which mountain system? When we talk about the winds, local wind, that is Chinook, it is associated with Rockies. And then you have Phone. Now, they are the ones which bring about some amount of warming. Where is it that Phone is experienced? Phone is experienced across the northern slope of Alps. Okay? So these you have to mention, right? These two. They create an early sowing season, etc. So overall, other than this, which is the other climatic impact that we are not mentioning here, you have to mention about valley inversion. You have to mention about upslope fog as well. Okay. So overall, this provides you with enough content to be able to write even 500 words out. Please don't leave your answer copy blank. There is no extra marks for leaving the answer copy blank. Howsoever or whatsoever space is provided, fill it up. Nobody is going to sit there and count the exact number of words. So even if our word limit is crossing by 15 words, 20 words, 30 words, as long as we are filling the space which is provided for a question, we should be safe. Okay, but content should not be lacking. Content is the king. Keep that in mind. Right? So, any doubt with respect to these areas? Further elaboration, if you have scope, then you can also talk about the jet streams in the case of Himalayas get bifurcated into northern southern branch, which influence the occurrence of or the onset of monsoons in India. So, like that, you can elaborate. Okay. Now, Is it enough to complete syllabus of? Yes, I think so. Now, thereby, another question which was asked, mention the global occurrence of volcanic eruption in 2021 and their impact on regional environment. Now, this follows a pattern of question which has been asked by UPSC again multiple times for the past couple of decades. And that is basically global distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes, right? So that is an area that UPSC focuses on. Now, mention the global occurrences of volcanic eruption in 2021. As a candidate, you are not required to ratify all the volcanic events which happen in an year. So don't get absolutely worried by this question. Just a broader idea where volcanic eruptions have occurred and also the reasons thereby. So, first of all, whenever you talk about these volcanic eruptions, the map has to be drawn, areas indicating volcanic presence. Now, every other year, certain areas will experience volcanic eruption. One is the region around Mount Etna in the southern Mediterranean, Vesuvius and Etna. Then you have the region around Iceland, the mid Atlantic ridge. Now, that year, La Palma eruption had happened, so that is why it was very famous, followed by the Tonga eruption, which had also occurred. Now, some of the eruptions across the Philippine plate, across Pinatubo or Tal. Now, in the last year, there have been multiple eruptions across the Indonesian arc. So these are the areas that you focus upon. Even if you don't recall the exact volcanic eruption name, just mention the areas where the eruption has occurred. And here, their impact on the regional environment. So, 150 worded answer, but following the 70-30 rule here. When you are mentioning the region where the volcanic eruption has occurred, also talk about the reasons for that, right? Oceanic subduction, or the presence of a hotspot, or the presence of mid oceanic ridge. So, that is something where the reasons also need to be mentioned. Now, after that, what is the impact on the regional environment? So, thereby, emission of large amount of CO2, right? The CO2 emission will provide further greenhouse effect, but also sulfur based aerosols that will provide a temporary cooling. That is something that you mentioned. Then, after that, you talk about the role of the volcanic ash, cooling. Okay. Now, that volcanic ash can make or render the vegetation to be futile in certain areas that you can mention. Also, talk about that many of the times this volcanic eruption can lead to seismicity in the region, creation of tsunamis. Also, all that you have to talk about. That is the regional environment. When you mention this about the regional environment, point subparagraph approach needs to be taken. Write a point and write a subparagraph next to it. Okay? Now, that is basically the kind of approach which is required. Now, areas to concentrate overall other than the interior. Theory of continental drift, seafloor spreading, and the plate tectonic. With the example of plates is very much required. Seismicity and volcanicity, global distribution. That map you practice, global distribution. Even in case of seismicity, even on the India level. When we talk about earthquake prone zones, which are the earthquake prone zones? In India, you have the Himalayan region, northeastern region, as well as the region of Gujarat. NCRT is enough to complete geography syllabus? Absolutely yes. Major as well as minor. Major plates, definitely. Some of the minor plates like the Nazca plate, Philippine Sea plate, Caroline Sea plate, Yuan de Fuca plate, some of these minor plates also you can recall. Cold mountains and their distribution. and landform, right? Fluvial, glacial. Now, in current affairs, there was a question and discussion about speleothems to karst, aeolian. Okay, just know the process of formation of these landforms. The image is something that you should retain. Rest of the thing you can frame in the exam hall. Okay, now from climatology. Now, from climatology, which are the areas that UPSC has been asking questions from? One of the pet areas for UPSC is the case of cyclones and natural disasters. So there, UPSC has been asking questions for the decade and a half multiple times, both in the optional as well as in GS. For those of us who are not aware, the general trend which is followed by UPSC is that in the case of physical geography, a question is asked first in the optional. Next year or the year after that, chances are that that unique question is repeated even in the GS. So when you take a look at the questions and the pattern in optional as well as GS for geography, UPSC has been focusing upon the area of cyclone. So the basic formation of cyclones has to be in the naming of cyclones. What is the process of naming? That is where you have to bring into idea and you have to remember the aspect about the presence of RSMCs, regional specialized meteorological centers, the tropical cyclone warning centers, as well as the role played by the WMO, where under the aegis of WMO and UNSCAP, you have, for example, in Northern Indian Ocean, 13 countries, all of them have given 13 names. So there is a list of 169 names. So that naming phenomena should be clear. The example of the RSMCs, there are six RSMCs across the world: RSMC Honolulu, RSMC Miami, RSMC Tokyo, RSMC Nadi, RSMC La Reunion Islands, and RSMC New Delhi. So these are the six global RSMCs which are responsible for the naming pattern. That is something which should be clear. And one thing which is very much required is the process of formation. Formation. Last year, UPSC had asked a question: what is sea surface temperature rise? How does it affect the formation of tropical cyclones? Now, if it is a 10 marker question, you don't have a lot of scope to elaborate about the impact of sea surface temperature rise overall. Just the aspect of how sea surface temperature rise is leading to greater frequency and higher intensity of tropical cyclone. Okay, so that needs to be talked about and that needs to be mentioned, right? The formation and the process where the tropical cyclone ends up behaving like a heat. What do we mean by heat engine? Whereby the cyclonic system is able to generate heat on its own, right? So, how is it able to do so? With the help of the latent heat of condensation. Latent heat of condensation. So, you have intense low pressure due to higher temperature. Now, this intense low pressure attracts moist winds. Now, these moist winds rise up and condense, rise up and condense. Now, after that, latent heat of condensation is released. Once latent heat of condensation is released, heating of the low pressure, further heating of surface. That further heating of surface leads to further intensification of the low pressure. So, this is basically the heat engine cycle. That needs to be clear. That is what was asked in and was being tested from the candidates when UPSC had framed this question. That whether you are able to depict and talk about the intensification of cyclone, right? Naming, intensification, and the process of forming. There was another question which was framed in 2022, owing to only being mentioned in current affairs. Meaning of color coded warning for cyclone prone areas given by IMD. So, here, what is required in this particular answer? The second question that you see, Is the approach that you simply mention the color codes? I will show you the color codes. Is simply the mention of color code sufficient? No. Here also, you have to follow the 70-30 rule. 70% you address what is asked, the implication of it. It helps in disaster management, saving of vulnerable population, rescuing of biodiversity, etc., that you can talk about. At the same time, it helps us understand the development of a cyclone. Thereby, a cyclone, as long as it stays over the water body, keeps on getting stronger and stronger. It becomes much more intense. So that is basically what was required here. The process of formation and the schematic needs to be produced if any question of tropical cyclone is asked. You cannot ignore the schematic. In case we are not very good in drawing this, a simple image would also suffice. Simple image which can be drawn within a minute. It is the helical rise, which is important, okay? And thereby formation of clouds, rain bands, which are created. Now, UPSC can very well repeat the disaster causing ability of the cyclones. Here you mention the eye, sinking air is required, sinking air, and cumulonimbus clouds, and then rain band. Even this image, which can be drawn very quickly, is more than sufficient. Practice this. Okay? Now, also be aware about the impact of a cyclone. So, impact of the cyclone in what sense? So, when we talk about the impact, what are the impacts of cyclone? Devastation, destruction, loss of life and property, everybody will write. Other than that, so storm surges, coastal flooding, right? Now, flooding is not only restricted to the coastline. We have studied that flooding is also experienced across the river systems, right? Because of the overflow, the rise in sea level. So, riverine flooding, then coastal erosion, then impact on biodiversity. All these you can act. Okay? This is the color coded warning system which UPSC had asked based upon the discussion in current affairs. Yes, mangrove damage, coral damage, that you have to mention in the impact in biodiversity. I hope this is clear. Any doubts that anyone has up till this particular point? Do let me know. Okay. Now, after this, we basically had another question last year, that is a twister or a kind of a tornado. Why are the majority of twisters observed in areas around the Gulf of Mexico? Right. So here, the formation of twister is important. So twisters are highly destructive storms which end up gaining speeds to the excess of 300 kilometer per hour, which causes destruction and is aided by the mixing of warm and cold air and a low pressure on the ground system. Should we mention current affairs examples like recent cyclones? No, not required. Not at all required. Right? Only if, let's suppose, there is a naming, there you mention some names in the last cyclone which had occurred. That also is something which is optional. Okay? As much as possible, go there with a clear mindset, not a lot of rectification baggage. Now, twister. How are twisters created? So, in the formation of twisters, what are required? So, in the formation of twisters, you need warm air to be coming from one region, cold air coming from another area, right? And the presence of wind shear. Wind shear is very important. Okay. So that basically provides with a kind of a rotational ability of these winds. And then the low pressure condition on the ground lifts this entire system upward. Okay. And thereby It meets with the cumulonimbus cloud in the sky, where you have the cold air downdraft, which meets with the rising air, and hence you have the formation of twister. I have attached a PDF, a detailed PDF here. For those of us who have not attended the class or who are not aware about it, you can read that. Okay. Now, why is it very common in the region of Gulf of Mexico, to the north of Gulf of Mexico? Because North America has got a unique physiography where you don't have an east to west mountain range or a barrier. That means the cold winds from the polar areas, they can penetrate to the southern part, and you have warm tropical winds originate. So as a consequence, you have frequent mixing of this cold and warm air, and the heating of the Great Plains creates that low pressure condition on the ground, which can create the uplift, and hence the formation of tornadoes can be observed. Now, I also understand. See, this image can be reproduced. This image can also be reproduced. But I understand that many of these images you cannot reproduce on paper. So, in that case, use a simple image like a very simple diagram or an image, okay, and talk about the twisters. It has been asked once, so twister question won't be asked again. This time, maybe a hailstorm or a cloudburst question, which was asked previously, that can be mentioned or that can be okay. What is the phenomena of cloudburst? This was a straightforward, simple question which was asked. So, in this case, how do you write the answer? So, basically, in the intro, talk about the definition of cloudburst. When do we say that a cloudburst has occurred? So, when do we say so? So, we declare it when you have in a restricted area, the area specification 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer within 1 hour, time restriction, and the amount greater than 10 centimeters. That is what is a cloudburst, right? Now, why does it occur? So, after definition, in the body, talk about the regions where the cloudbursts occur, mostly in the regions of the hills and the mountains, sometimes in the regions of the plains, and with the help of schematic diagram represent and talk about that how the clouds become unsustainably large, where they cannot hold themselves together anymore, and that is where they give way and everything drops, right? So that is where you talk about the formation, the process, and this is where the image can be represented, the diagram can be included here. Okay, now what do you write in the conclusion here? The conclusion basically talks about the impact. So, if it was a 10 marker question, in the conclusion, if it is a 15 marker question, later part of the body itself. What are the impact? Flash floods, then basically landslides, mass movement, all these avalanches, these are basically the eventual. Okay? Right. GLOF events you can talk about. Yesterday, cloudburst has occurred in Himachal Pradesh. Yes. Now, we have discussed separately in the Conquer Mains module as well that you can be asked about the cloudburst vulnerability across India. Which regions are exposed to cloudburst? There, you have to focus on regions of Himachal, regions of Uttarakhand, Sikkim, Arunachal. These areas you have to focus upon. Okay. Now, a simple, straightforward question. Troposphere is a very significant atmospheric layer that determines the weather process. How? 15 marker question, a detailed answer would be required. So, what do you write in this? So, in this intro, what is troposphere? Lowest layer of the atmosphere consisting of 80% of the mass of the atmosphere. That is where your definition would. It is witness or it is where majority of the weather conditions and climatic events are witnessed. That's it. Then in the body part, talk about the features. Features. Now here, vertical mixing of air. Now, why do you have a vertical mixing of air? Due to negative lapse rate or rather positive lapse rate, right? Positive lapse rate. Then after that, you also have to mention about atmospheric circulation. is restricted within the troposphere. Why the atmospheric circulation is restricted within the troposphere? Because beyond troposphere, the temperature starts to increase in stratosphere. There's a negative lapse rate. So that is why all the atmospheric circulation, cloud formation, etc., that is restricted in troposphere. So vertical mixing of air is what you have to concentrate. Air and atmospheric movement is also something you have to. Okay. Now, one of the outlier questions, discuss the concept of air mass and explain its role in macroclimatic changes. What do you write in? Concept of air mass. What is an air mass? Air mass is a large parcel of air having homogeneous property of temperature, humidity, pressure, etc., which is spread over a larger area. This air mass gains its property based upon the surface that it is in contact with. That is where you also discuss about the concept, very briefly mention about the concept of source region. Okay. Now, major types of air mass: tropical, continental, and maritime. That is the classification. Then you have tropical, polar, Arctic, Antarctic. That is the classification. So, just give examples of this air mass. Then, what are the impact on climate? Precipitation and thunderstorms. Upon maritime air mass will always bring rainfall, temperature by the process of advection. Example you give: creation of cyclones, both temperate and tropical. Inversion conditions, whenever you have the meeting of the air masses, the creation of fog, mist, stability, everything can mention. And eventually, influence on life and biodiversity is how you conclude. Okay. So, areas to focus upon in the entirety of climatology: layers of atmosphere and lapse rate, permanent wind systems, very, very important, atmospheric phenomena like cyclones. Now, temperate cyclones can also be asked. Please keep that in mind. So, temperate cyclones, the stages of formation, that can also be asked, right? Tropical, anyways, you have to know. Cloudbursts, hailstorms, okay? These are the details that you can mention. What is stable condition? Stable condition is when you have the lack of vertical mixing of air. That is when near the ground you have colder air and above it you have warmer air. So the air does not mix naturally. That is the atmospheric stability. Okay. Now, even in the case of Indian monsoon, you have had focus area on Indian monsoon where questions are asked from the property of Indian monsoon. Do we have to draw all the diagrams of front formation, occlusion? In the case of a cyclone, temperate cyclone, yes, because you have to talk about the subsequent development of cyclone, the initial stage, stationary front, then the intensification of the front, mature stage, beginning of occlusion, that you have to mention. Okay. Now, in Indian monsoon, what is the southwest monsoon? Or why is the southwest monsoon called Purvaya in Bhojpur region? That is in the region of Bihar. How has this directional seasonal wind system influenced the cultural ethos of the region? Now, southwest monsoon, why is it is referred to as Purvaya? So there you have to draw the map of India and talk about that how in the region of Bihar, the monsoonal winds, they travel from east to west. They bring rainfall from the moisture source of Bay of Bengal. And that marks the onset of the rainy season in India. So these winds which bring rainfall associated with slightly cooler conditions, they are known as Purvayas. Now, how has this influenced the cultural ethos? So it is not the retreating monsoon, it is the onset of monsoon, advancing monsoon. Okay, advancing monsoon. It is not the retreating monsoon. Okay, now hereby it marks or it initiates the beginning or the onset of the sowing season. That is something that you mentioned, onset of the sowing season. various festivities like the case of Shravan, the entire month. Then you have Tej, etc., which is being celebrated. Then it marks the onset of the conditions of fertility and life provider. So, like that, you can talk about the cultural ethos. Okay, the sowing festivals at Tej, that is where it comes in. Shravan, that is where it comes in. So that is the season. The Shravan season is marked by pilgrimages, etc. Okay. Now, what characteristic can be assigned to monsoon climate that succeeds in feeding more than 50% of the world population residing in monsoonal Asia? So it is a 15 marker question. It was a 15 marker question. In this, what do you have to talk about? You have to talk about the seasonal reversal of wind. Seasonal reversal. Now, when you talk about seasonal reversal, you also have to talk about concentration of rainfall. Concentration of rainfall. That is also required. We mentioned. Okay. After that, you also have to mention about the case of how it provides for the natural vegetation, provides for aquaculture, fisheries, etc. Now, characteristic at the end of the summer season that you have to mention that heating during the summer conditions provides or creates the intense low pressure. The ITCZ shifts north, right? This attracts moist winds from the south, right? From water bodies, because water bodies comparatively are cooler, so they are the regions of high pressure. So these detailings you need to provide. Now, where do we experience this? Is it only in India? No, Bangladesh as well. Then, when we talk about Thailand, Vietnam, these countries also experience that. Okay. Now, crops like paddy cultivation, they are initiated, and flood irrigation is something which is practiced the monsoonal. Okay. So, that is the approach is required. Then, how far do you agree that behavior of the Indian monsoon has been changing due to humanizing landscape? Discuss. So behavior of monsoon has been changing. So what do you talk about this? Or what do you mention in this? In this, basically, the changing land use pattern. So deforestation, right? Give examples of northeastern India, which changes the uniform distribution of rainfall. Concentrated spells of rainfall are observed. And then after that, urban heat islands are created. Heat islands. They get created, they get formed. So, what are these urban heat islands? Now, they also end up causing heat waves followed by sudden burst of rainfall, which can cause urban flooding in these regions. Okay. Now, this has brought about a variability of rainfall. It has also brought about an unpredictability in the case of onset and early withdrawal as well. Withdrawal. Why? Because very quickly and very early now, you have the re-establishment of the southern branch of the jet stream, which brings about the early withdrawal of this monsoon and creation of dry spell. Here, the main crux of the question is example. Examples which has to be based upon different regions of the country. You also have to talk about the impact of it because it is a 15 marker question. The impact, heat waves, drought, agricultural losses, etc., that you have to mention. Okay. Now, in oceanography, so that is the aspect of the monsoon. Same kind of questions and patterns will be asked when it comes to monsoon. the property of it, and the regional behavior, the regional characteristic of monsoon. Onset of monsoon has been in discussion this year. I hope we have taken a look at the detailed video about what is declared or when is it declared that the onset of monsoon happens. Prepare accordingly, right? And what is the overall impact of that? Now, then after that, oceanography. Is it every question needs way forward? No, not every question requires way forward. Some of these technical questions just need a summarization of what you have written. Now, in oceanography, you see, UPSC has been repeating questions associated with ocean currents. So, what are the forces that influence the ocean currents? Describe their role in the fishing industry of the world. Explain the factors responsible for the origin of the ocean currents. How do they influence regional climate, fishing, and navigation? You will find question has been repeated. If I were to consider questions of the previous 15 years, again it would have been repeated at least. So you can expect this question. So what do you prepare for this area? So in this, basically when you talk about ocean currents, so here the forces responsible. So definition of it needs to be clear. The forces responsible. What are the forces? You have the primary and the secondary. Okay. Now, in the primary forces, what are the ones that you will highlight? Heating by the sun and the role of the winds. And when we talk about secondary, what do you have to highlight in secondary? You have to highlight about Coriolis force, then shape of coast, then other than that, bottom relief. Okay. Now, also advisable to keep a track of the major ocean currents across the globe. Atlantic, a very much copycat of Atlantic is the Pacific and Southern Indian Ocean. Northern Indian Ocean is different. That is why you can also expect a question, discuss the role of winds in ocean currents. Okay, with focus on or explaining the ocean currents in the Northern Indian Ocean. In the case of Northern Indian Ocean, you have a seasonal reversal of the winds. And that seasonal reversal of the winds brings about a reversal in the oceanic circulation. Okay? Now, here the impact of it as well. Impact and the implication. Mixing of cold and warm ocean currents like the Kuroshio and the Oyashio, Gulf Stream and the Labrador Stream, Brazil current and Falkland current creates fishing grounds. Then deserts due to temperature inversion in the region of the western margins of the continents. Deserts, they bring rainfall, they help in navigation. Okay. Then other than that, these ocean currents, they also help in maintenance of the temperature, the heat budget and the salt budget of the ocean. So ocean temperature is maintained. Also influences biodiversity. These impact in some way or the other can be framed. Okay. Now, these are some of the major ocean currents. In the case of Atlantic, you have to keep in mind the warm and the cold current. Get a schematic image of the Atlantic, Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. That practice should be a very simple, straightforward practice. It won't require much of an effort. Basically, the north equatorial, south equatorial current, and that then eventually turns rightwards in the northern hemisphere and leftwards in the southern hemisphere. In the southern ocean, you have a complete circumambulation of the west wind drift. That is something which is required. Okay, so I've attached this in the PDF itself. That will help you in revision. Only in the northern Indian Ocean is an aberration because in the month of advancing monsoon, this is the direction of the winds, and that creates a kind of a clockwise circulation. And then you have the reversal of the winds, the northeast monsoon, and you have counterclockwise circulation. Now, How do ocean currents and water masses differ in their impact on marine life and coastal environment? Give suitable water masses. Now, what is different between ocean currents and water masses? Water masses basically are representation of a just like an air mass. Air mass represents an area of air parcel having uniformity of temperature, pressure, humidity, etc. Similarly, water mass are large masses of water having a uniform temperature, salinity conditions. Now, where do you find these water masses? They are found in greater depth. Okay. Now, what is the role of these water masses? Ocean currents, while they are experienced on the surface and the surface circulation, water masses are associated with deeper thermohaline circulation. Haline circulation. Now, what is the role of this thermohaline circulation in the impact on the coastal environment and overall on life? Basically, here you have to mention and talk about the role of nutrient balancing. Okay, global conveyor belt. Then after that, nutrient balancing. Then after that, heat balancing, heat budget. Okay. Now this allows for seasonal migration of the species from one region to another and thereby fulfill the biodiversity requirements. That is what you have to talk about in the case of water mass. Coastal environment, if let's suppose the thermohaline circulation or the water masses at the depth they are colder, that allows for greater mixing in the thermohaline circulation. So that brings about a greater loss of heat from water to atmosphere, which can bring about evaporation, cloud cover, and continued rainfall in the coastal area experienced in the British type of climate. However, if these water masses, their temperature tends to rise, then this thermohaline circulation or the vertical mixing that gets prevented, which can give rise to increased frequency of storms, cyclones, as well as the creation of heat waves. Okay, so that is something that you can talk about and mention. Okay, now account for variations in oceanic salinity and discuss its multidimensional impact. Now, in this case, oceanic salinity, the intro has to talk about what is oceanic salinity. And here you have to talk about both horizontal and vertical distribution of salinity. Now, when you are talking about horizontal distribution of salinity, in the horizontal, what do you mention? What factors do you mention? You mention the role played by evaporation with example, precipitation in the case of equatorial regions. Then you mention the case of influx of rivers, how that influences salinity. Then after that, you mention freezing and melting of and ice. This is what you highlight with the help of example. Now, in the case of vertical distribution of temperature, there the role of halocline and the image associated. Now, multidimensional effect, again, in terms of maintenance of nutrient balance, salt budgeting, and even in terms of the species distribution, there will be. Okay. Examples of each one of them need to be provided, particularly the North Sea. That is an example. Bay of Bengal, Arabian Sea, a comparative analysis of salinity. Salinity will always be lower in the case of Bay of Bengal because of higher influx of river, which can lead to stratification. And that stratification can eventually give rise to greater amount of cyclogenesis as well. Okay. So those examples can provide. Climate change angle. Absolutely, yes. You have questions associated with climate change which are asked. So obviously, you have to add. angle associated with climate change. Mention the significance of straits and isthmus in international trade. So here you have to mention what are these straits first of all. Water bodies connecting two larger water bodies and separating two narrow land areas. So this provides way of maritime trade, right? Acts for regional connectivity. Give example of these straits. Strait of Gibraltar, Strait of Hormuz, Malacca Strait, Bab al-Mandeb. These are the very busy straits across the world. Now they also form what are known as choke points, vital choke points, where trade and supply chain gap can be created, right? So that can always be disrupted as well. So those negative angle and the positive angle of straits and isthmus, isthmus of Kra, isthmus of Panama, isthmus of Suez across the Sinai, these examples of isthmus you provide. Now, in the case of isthmus, they provide a land connectivity. The case of the isthmus of Panama across the Darien Gap that provides a land boundary and a route for human movement, right? Then, in the case of isthmus of Kra, again, it connects the Malayan Peninsula with the mainland. So, like that, you can provide these examples. Okay? Any doubts anyone is facing in any of the questions? Do let me know. So areas to focus in oceanography, very simple. Ocean currents and physical properties of water. And this involves temperature, salinity, density. Okay. These are the areas that you can focus upon. However, also advisable to get the basic idea of tides and the impact of tides. Why? Because tides have also been in news throughout last year, owing to the study and the findings that greater tidal currents have a role to play in coastal erosion, particularly across the eastern coast of India, across regions like Sriharikota. So that is where tides and also the areas of coastal erosion that needs to be kept in mind. For mains, is NCRT enough along with the basic foundation? Now, climate change and water security. Observe how the pattern of questions are very similar in this. How do the melting of Arctic and the Arctic ice and the glaciers of an Antarctic differently affect the weather patterns and human activities? Understand this question. It asks about why it is different when the Arctic melts and how it is different from when the Antarctic. Now, before we discuss, look at the similarity. How does the cryosphere affect the global climate? Cryosphere means the frozen areas across the planet. What is their role in global climate? Right? How will the melting of Himalayan glaciers have a far reaching impact on the water resource? So, a similar pattern or a trend. Now, the process of desertification is different, but the melting portion is where you have a commonality. So, in the region of Arctic, when you have melting in the region of Arctic, what does it lead to? It leads to Arctic amplification. Are we aware? I hope we are aware of the albedo circle. That is where, due to melting of ice in the Arctic, water and thinner ice is exposed. That means greater amount of solar rays are absorbed due to lower value of albedo. As a consequence of that, it leads to further warming and further accelerated melting. Okay, so Arctic amplification, that is something that you mentioned. Then what is the other role? Slowing down of the thermohaline circulation. Slowing down of thermohaline circulation, right? The vertical mixing does not occur anymore. Then other than that, opens up new trade routes. The Arctic route that has been opened up. Now, other than that, minerals like fossil fuel. Okay. So these are basically some of the areas which are impacted due to the melting of the Arctic ice. When we talk about Antarctic region, how does the melting impact the local climate? First of all, what is the role of the melting? So the melting ends up initiating a wind pattern which is very much stronger. Okay. And also it influences the planetary winds. Planetary winds, right? Rise of sea level in both the cases you have to mention in sea level. Then many regions, again due to the process of lower albedo, many regions in the periphery of Antarctic, they have begun to stay ice free. Lower albedo, ice free, and it was observed that this is a region which has experienced the growth of flowering plants, altering the biodiversity now. Also influences trade and navigation. Also, you talk about the glacier, the kind of icebergs which can also create navigational disaster. Navigation. Okay, so these are some of the areas which you can talk about and mention and elaborate. In the initial part of the introduction of this answer, you do have to mention that Arctic and Antarctic ice or ice sheets across the polar regions are experienced and are experiencing an accelerated rate of melting owing to the events or impact of global warming. However, the impact of both of them act differently in each of the hemisphere, and that provides the flow to the body. Thereby, in the body, talk about the role of the melting of the Arctic ice. Draw the albedo circle as well, that how melting initiates or kickstarts Arctic amplification. That can also lead to the melting of the permafrost regions closer to the Arctic. And this can also add to pollution, greater amount of warming, right? Now, how does the cryosphere affect the global climate? The cryosphere, that is the ice presence, that basically reflects the solar rays, maintains the heat budget of planet Earth. At the same time, these are the regions which ensure a temperature balance across the various different areas. Can we mention A23 northward? Yes, you can talk about that. Example, you can mention, yes. So, cryosphere, so heat budget is maintained. Okay. Then after that, you basically also have to talk about the case of uh, here albedo, right? Then after that, genesis of local winds, high pressure region, polar highs. Okay, they carry out the process, so that leads to generation of wind patterns, the polar easterlies, which are permanent winds. Then also leads to freezing, which can influence oceanic circulation as well. So these things you need to mention in this particular question. How will the melting of Himalayan glaciers have a far-reaching impact on the water resource? This is again one of the question which is repeated multiple times. It will also have slight impact on the polar vortex. Melting of Himalayan glaciers and the impact on water security. It is repeated. So in this, what needs to be written? In this, you have to write about that both the short-term impact and the long-term impact. So short term and long term. Short term impact of the melting of glaciers. It can lead to floods, mass movement, landslides, avalanches, bluffs. Okay, this can happen. Long term, drought cycle. groundwater depletion, water depletion, seasonality of rivers, right? Influence on climate. Why? Due to ice-free Himalayas. So all these, always in the question of the melting of glaciers in Himalayas, either the reason will be asked. So pollution can be one of the reasons. The black carbon deposits can be one of the reasons. Climate change can be one of the reasons. Global warming, etc. And the impact, both short term and long term, has to be right. Now, process of desertification does not have climate boundaries. Justify with example. Now, when we talk about desertification, now, this is a question associated with climate change, that why that desertification is happening. So, in this, you have to talk about that desertification is not only initiated due to warmer climate. You also have desertification which is associated with continentality first. Continentality. Example, deserts in Central Asia. Deserts like Ladakh. Okay. Other than that, you also have to establish a relationship between land degradation and how land degradation eventually will lead to desertification. So, when we say land degradation owing to multiple factors such as, let's suppose, drought cycle, pollution, excess use of fertilizers, saline soil condition due to over irrigation, monocropping patterns, all of these can lead to land degradation. And eventually, that can usher in low productivity. The soil will be remaining barren, leading to soil erosion, low productivity of the subsoil, and eventual desert. Give example of regions like Haryana, Western Madhya Pradesh, some sections of Punjab. All these areas are getting or are being experienced or have been experiencing desertification. So this is not associated with a climate boundary, it is associated with the physiography. Also, talk about the role of, let's suppose, the case of anthropogenic events, like land use pattern changes. That is also going to bring about degradation of land. Then talk about, let's suppose, the mining across the region of Aravallis. That brings wind erosion from the Thar Desert into the peripheral areas, bringing about a greater scope of desertification. So that also can be mentioned. Do we have to explain how? In this particular question, yes, you do have to explain how. You can mention UNCCD land degradation neutrality, the land degradation neutrality initiative by UNCCD. Okay. Or you can even mention Bond challenge. Any of these you can mention. Okay. Now, assess the impact of global warming on coral life ecosystem with example. This is a simple, straightforward question which is requiring you to talk about coral bleaching. Coral bleaching. Now, coral bleaching due to which reason? Due to marine heat wave. Marine. Okay. So that is what you have to mention here. Also, when we talk about the coral life ecosystem, talk about that how these marine heat waves have caused bleaching in various areas. So which are the regions? Of the Pacific, in the region across the area of, even when we talk about Indian Ocean, there also these bleaching events have been experienced. The rise in sea surface temperature, what it leads to, the zooxanthellae population, their productivity declines by 60% to 90%. And that decline in productivity is associated, basically, bottom trawling is not required to be mentioned here. Straightforward question is impact of global warming. No requirement of the other aspects here. Global warming, rise in sea surface temperature will lead to the low productivity of zooxanthellae. That is one reason. Other factor is that global warming also leads to the spread of zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases which will impact the zooxanthellae, bugs, algae, and that can lead to bleach. Okay? So, for example, fungal infection, bacterial infection, etc. Can we add the chemical reaction of the carbonates and acidification? Acidification is not asked. Had it been a question of greater anthropogenic events, then you could have talked about acidification. It is not asked here, so not required. Okay. Now, associated with water resource, look at how a series of questions follow the same trend. I have clubbed these questions together. Look at these questions, analyze them. Groundwater potential of the Gangetic Valley is on a serious decline. How may it affect the food security of India? The groundwater potential, over extraction, right? Contamination of the groundwater, right? Now, it is on a serious decline. How will it impact the food security? Water for irrigation. Majority of the areas are dependent on tube well irrigation. So that basically brings into question the ability to produce the same amount of food, given the fact that the climatic conditions are becoming unpredictable. Why is the world today confronted with a crisis of availability of and access to fresh water resources? What is water stress? How and why does it differ regionally in India? Regional variation of water stress. Ideal solution to depleting groundwater resources system in India is a water harvesting system. How can it be made effective in urban areas? So the same problem that the country is facing, that has been stressed upon by UPS. So what do you need to keep in mind? A couple of images and diagrams you have to keep in mind. One is the groundwater potential, right? The water table, where it is depleted. Broader idea is also sufficient. And not only that, due to this depletion of groundwater, there is also groundwater contamination. So both these images you have to keep in mind. Arsenic contamination, fluoride contamination, as well as the salinity, the brackishness, which is observed in groundwater, particularly in the region around Ganganagar and the areas downstream of the Indira Gandhi Canal network. Those are the areas that you can reproduce in the map. Okay. Other than that, you have to focus upon micro watershed management, micro irrigation techniques, also the aspect of water conservation through rainwater harvesting system, the urban planning development according to imbibing the rainwater harvesting ecosystem. That is the common stress of the or the common focus of answer. Now, the reason that they will ask that why the water stress is there, climate change, changing land use pattern. These are the two reasons. Climate change, changing land use pattern. What have they done? Drought cycles followed by excess rainfall. So the water is not stored, right? Water along with the soil gets eroded. The water is not captured. So changing land use pattern, you should not forget. Climate change, obviously, you will not forget while writing the answer. India is well endowed with fresh water resources. Critically examine why it still suffers from water scarcity. The same kind of a question. Observe how many times the same question has been. As you can see, in the past 10 years, you have found 5 to 6 such questions. That means every second year, this is a question which is repeated about water security in India. So here, why does India experience water scarcity? So, climate change, changing land use pattern, climate change will bring about changed monsoonal behavior, or anthropogenic impact, like, for example, concretization in the urban areas has led to the fact that water is not absorbed, rather, the water tends to flow, isn't it? Then, after that, the kind of unsustainable agriculture where you grow paddy in areas where rainfall is very scarce. Example, Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, the Green Revolution areas. Then, after that, flood irrigation techniques are used. Water intensive crops like sugarcane grown in Vidarbha region. That is the agricultural aspect that you have to mention. Lack of enough water storage structures, isn't it? Lack, that is, enough dams, barrages, emergency canals, etc., are not built, right? Then pollution of water means majority of the freshwater resources, they become non-utilizable. That again can mention. You need to draw a map for water scarcity. Map is required regardless of whatever is a question for water scarcity. A map is always required. So the reasons here: climate change, okay, that climate change brings about changing pattern of rainfall, which brings about droughts. Then land use pattern is changing. Then agriculture, sustainable agriculture. There you mention about the paddy growing areas in Green Revolution region, sugarcane in Vidarbh, again in Punjab as well, flood irrigation. Then after that, contamination, pollution, okay, lack of recharge, concretization, then basically destruction of natural sponges like lakes and ponds destroyed. The recharge of groundwater is not happening. Then excessive extraction due to population density and lack of pipe drinking water supply, population density, lack of piped water supply. All of these can be the reasons which can be elaborated. Case study of Maharashtra water crisis, case study of a water crisis even in Madhya Pradesh, in very Telangana, all that. Not enough storage structures, lack of storage structures. Okay, Bangalore, yes, can talk about how land use pattern influences water scarcity. So basically, if let's suppose you carry out deforestation and you create an urban sphere there, that means the water which would be absorbed by the soil in that region, now it is not absorbing that, now that water is draining away, right? So water is not being utilized, so like that. Okay, now, so in the case of Indian geography, water security and the Himalayas, they play a very important. Now, in Indian geography, which are the areas to concentrate upon? Disasters, landslides. So, again, look at the repetition. Differentiate the causes of landslides in the Himalayan region and Western Ghats. And the Himalayas are highly prone to landslides. Discuss the causes and suggest suitable measures of. So, here, the reasons for landslides, that should be clear. And also, a rough diagram, the landslide prone regions. Which are the landslide prone regions? Southern part of Western Ghats around the region of Wayanad, and in the northern part, you have Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh. These are the areas very prone to landslide. Now, the reasons for landslide. Now, reasons for landslides are different in the case of Himalayan region as compared to the Western Ghats. Now, why more landslides in Himalayas? Basically, concentrated rainfall, cloudbursts, etc. But before that, tectonic reasons. Tectonic, these are still evolving slopes, evolving slopes, seismically active, so frequent earthquakes can occur. Then, after that, you have the hogback topography in the region of Himalayas, which means a distinct southern slope which is very steep. and northern slope, which is gentle, isn't it? Then after that, you also have the case where in the northern region you have events of cloudbursts, then deforestation, right? Then unsustainable tourism, infrastructure like roads without proper EIA environmental impact assessment. Then after that, you also talk about regions associated, let's suppose the regions like mining activities in the region of northern India and even in eastern part of India. Okay, so that is where you also have to talk about the role of forest fire. Forest fires, they dry up the soil in the region. This is aided by climate change and changing land use pattern. That also can bring in the landslide. Okay, so these are the reasons. Observe, it is repeated. It can be repeated again. Okay, so you should be aware of these reasons. Now, discuss the natural resource potential of the Deccan Trap. So, for this, you need to be aware about how the Deccan Trap is created. Deccan Trap is created how? By flood basalt, isn't it? By flood basalt. So, here in the initial part of the answer, talk about this Deccan Trap. The features. Features. What are the features? Layers of igneous rocks, isn't it? Layers, step like feature. That is where the term trapin or trap has been given. Step like features. Then, after that, what do you mention? You talk about the resource potential, right? Or even if you want to talk about the kind of rocks in the features, basaltic rock, basaltic rocks. Okay, the region has black soil. Now, the minerals which are available in the fringes, for example, in the eastern part of the Deccan Traps, in the region of Maharashtra, you will find the deposits of iron, coal, etc. in the exact fringes. Then, inter within the traps, there is expectation of formation and the presence of some of the fossil fuel areas also. Then black soil, good for agricultural purpose. Groundwater resources are to be found within these layers of the igneous rocks as well. So these are some of the features or the natural resources. So in the natural resources, minerals, now soil, again, other than that, you also have to talk about groundwater. Okay. So this is basically the requirement of. Now, interlinking of rivers again has been repeated and is repeated multiple times since 2000. So for the past 25 years, UPSC has been asking questions from interlinking of rivers in mains as well as in the interview. So for interlinking of rivers can provide viable solution to the multidimensional interrelated problems of droughts, floods, and interrupted navigation. So critically examine both advantages and disadvantages should. In what way can floods be converted into a sustainable source of irrigation and all-weather inland navigation? Again, interlinking. So here, current affairs example. Current example. In Betwa interlink, Kosi Mechi interlink. Okay, they need to be cited. Now you also need to be aware of the various phases of interlinking. There are three phases of the Himalayan phase, the peninsular phase, and the interlink between both of them. That needs to be talked about. Now here you can also talk about the advantages and the disadvantages. When we say, let's suppose, advantages of interlink, and when we mention the disadvantages of. So what are the advantages? Twin cycle of flood and drought, that will be taken care of, isn't it? Then other than that, inland navigation, water security, Then, other than that, energy generation, hydropower, energy generation, right? Then, inland navigation, pisciculture, aquaculture, creation of more jobs, all of that can be mentioned. Disadvantages: high cost, displacement, then basically inundation of forested areas. Those are basically the disadvantages. Population relocation, land acquisition issues, biodiversity, cultural impact in terms of the sharing of the river water. Advantages: this can solve the river water disputes by ensuring abundant water flow across the river channels throughout the year. So, those can be your advantages and disadvantages. Okay. Now, comment on the resource potential of the long coastline of India and highlight the status of the natural hazard preparedness. Very simple question was asked. So in the intro, you mentioned about the long coastline of India, that India has got, or India is blessed with a coastline of more than 7,000 kilometers or plus. And thereafter, you start mentioning about the resources. Which are the resources that you mentioned? So, resources, minerals. Which are the minerals? Hydrocarbons, Krishna Godavari Basin, in the region across the Konkan coast as well. The hydrocarbon exploration is going on. Then monazite sands in the region across Kerala coastline. Monazite sands are also to be found, right? Then, other than that, pisciculture, culture or aquaculture, right? Then that is the blue revolution aspect. Then, other than that, agricultural produce. There is also another kind of mineral, that is iron, particularly across the Konkan coast, right? So agri produce, then energy, renewable energy can be generated. Okay. So all these are, even in terms of biodiversity, that is huge, right? Then after that, tourism, right? All these are the resource potential of the longer coastline. Natural hazard preparedness, you basically have the cyclone and the tsunami early warning system. Those are the natural hazards which are targeted here: cyclones and tsunamis. So, weather stations, early warning detection, etc. In the case of the tsunamis, and even the buffer vegetation and plantation of mangrove across the coastal area, that serves as a break of the waves. The waves end up breaking there. So, those can always serve as a relevant example of the natural hazard prepare. Okay. Now, after this, the renewable resources. From there, also, questions have been asked: wind energy, solar energy. But these are not randomly asked. These have been asked in the years when they have been in news, they have been in discussion. Presently, if you are preparing for this year or next year, for world also as well as India, what do you prepare for? EV, electric vehicles, right? So, the renewable in terms of green hydrogen, green mobility, those are the areas that you prepare for. Okay. So that is something which you have to keep in mind. The coastal regulation zone, CRZ regulation, will be important for your GS3, not in GS paper 1. Okay. So CRZ regulation is relevant in your GS paper 3. So examine the potential of wind energy in India and explain the regions for their limited spatial spread. Now, why is it that India has got, first of all, potential? Is potential there? Absolutely yes. Can we draw the diagram with pencil in exam? Yes, you can. No issues. Now, is the potential there? Yes. Where is the potential highest? In the coastal states, in the island regions, and the semi arid areas. Gujarat and Rajasthan, and Western Madhya Pradesh. Majority of the candidates, when they talk about the potential of wind energy, they are restricted only to the coastal areas. Semi-arid regions are also where the wind patterns or the wind speed is very high due to low resistance force. So that also you have to mention. So regions where you have the wind energy potential. And the reasons, before talking about the reasons, you also talk about offshore potential is also high, even onshore, the coastal region. The potential is very, very high. Okay. Now, what is the reason for the limited spatial spread? There are multiple issues. Population density being one. Then, other than that, the wind is not regular. The wind pattern is continuously changing owing to the distribution of land and water, indented coastline, etc., due to which you don't have regular wind movement, lack of infrastructure development, then human intervention in terms of land acquisition issues. All those can be the reasons why they are still not very prominent. Okay, so the limited spatial spread is owing to the lack of regular wind movement, land acquisition issues, then basically the presence of the presence of water body nearby creates a sporadic changed weather pattern, storm prone areas where wind energy cannot be generated reliably. Those are your aspects. Lack of technological development also you can cite. India has immense potential for solar energy, though there are regional variations in its development. Potential for solar energy is huge. Why? Because the overall average amount of solar insolation is very high. Why? Because of its location in the lower latitude. That is the straightforward answer. Now, there are regional variations in its development. This is owing to land availability. Okay. Now, where is it that it is very massively or progressing at a greater pace? In regions of Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Rajasthan, where you have greater proportion of wastelands. Other areas, basically, you have an expanding population. Then we have the forested area also. So solar energy cannot be implemented on this. Here, in the remaining part of the question answer or in the way forward type, you also have to talk about the role of micro solar, that is rooftop solar. Rooftop solar. That also has to be highlighted. Okay, that going ahead into the future, if we have to basically capitalize on this, rooftop solar is the way to decentralized way of solar generation. Do you mention International Solar Alliance in this or not? Is that required to be mentioned or not? Absolutely. International Solar Alliance is absolutely required to be mentioned. Okay, that is what will provide the relevance even in the global context. So that requires to be provided. Okay, now there are multiple questions associated with urban issues in Indian job. Just to show you a trend. So why do large cities tend to attract more migrants than small towns? Discuss in the light of conditions in developing countries. This is owing to the migrational pattern. Migration. Now, why do we have greater amount of migration in the large city? So here you have to describe the pull factors of large city. So which are the pull factors of large city? First of all, you have to talk about economic opportunities, right? Industrialization, etc., service sector. So you have large economic opportunities. Then you also talk about the societal factor, lack of discrimination, greater acceptance to diversity, etc. diversity, open societies. Then the standard of living, access to infra, access to infra in the tune of the, let's suppose when we talk about education, healthcare, etc. So nutrition, education, healthcare, all these can be the examples as well, right? Easy mode of commute. Lack of discrimination, however, is to be mentioned. Lack of discrimination. Economic opportunities has to be stressed upon. And this is where you highlight greater population densities in regions like Delhi NCR, Mumbai metropolitan area, Bangalore, then Hyderabad. These are the zones of in migration or immigrant population. Okay, so these are basically the reasons why large cities tend to attract. Now, in the introduction itself, you do have to mention that in these kind of questions, the conclusion has to provide a way forward. But in the introduction, you do have to mention that internal migration is very common and very prominent, particularly the trend of rural to urban migration, which is present in most of the developing nations. Now, this is aided by certain pull factors that the larger cities have. Now, these pull factors they account for economic, then socio-cultural, and aspect of society as well, right? Standard of living. And thereafter, you discuss each of them in point subpoint. Now, if it is a 15 marker question, at the end of it, simply discuss and talk about the relevance of having these kind of or the impact of it. So it can lead to urban crisis, urban mismanagement, waste accumulation, etc., urban pollution, etc. The need of the hour is to ensure enough economic opportunity and ensure the retention of population in the places of origin. Otherwise, the urban areas, particularly in countries like India, face an implosion and or face a stagnation, eventually leading to a situation of implosion. Impacts you have to mention. If it is a 15 marker question, some of the impacts you can mention in the later part of the body. Now look at some of the other urban issues based question also. So, what are the environmental implication of reclamation of water bodies into urban land use? Sponge cities, right? That is basically the destruction of lakes and ponds. So, what is the impact of that? Urban floods, then a lesser groundwater replenishment, then the water cycle gets disrupted, then biodiversity like migratory birds they get impacted, right? Now, on the same issue, account for the huge flooding of the millions of cities in India, including the smart ones like Hyderabad and Pune. Suggest lasting remedial creation of ponds, natural aquifers, topography, maintenance of original topography, the decluttering of the drainage streams, like in Hyderabad, the cleaning of River Musi, again, urban flooding. Major cities of India are becoming vulnerable to flood conditions. Discuss. To observe every few years, the same question gets repeated about urban issues. So, excess pollution, the kind of occupation of the floodplains, settlement across the floodplains, that hinders the flow, the natural flow of the river water. Then the kind of occupation over the lakes and the ponds that prevents the recharge of the groundwater. That also then also talk about pollution aspect, the pollution angle. Then talk about the impact on water scarcity, impact on biodiversity, concretization. That is which is but this is a trend along with either water security or urban issue. That will be asked. Earlier, you had questions associated with air pollution also. Now, if you observe this question carefully, Mumbai, Delhi, and Kolkata are the three megacities of the country, but the air pollution is much more serious problem in Delhi as compared to the other two. Why is it so? So here you had to talk about the geographical conditions which are associated with pollution in Delhi. Mumbai and Kolkata coastal towns. So you have frequent land and sea breeze. Mixing of air happens. Delhi is continental. So as a consequence, the mixing does not happen. During winter, Delhi experiences inversion also. So continentality, reality, right? Winters, inversion, lack of mixing. Continentality means less rains. If there are rainfall as well, then also that leads to the dissipation of the pollutants. Then presence of westerly winds brings more pollutants into the region of Delhi. All those factors you have to accumulate, right? Now, then urban transportation, how efficient and affordable urban mass transport is key to the rapid economic development in India. And this is akin. So basically, it will lead to when you have a rapid urban transport. Why was this asked in 2019? Because around 2019, the rapid rail transit system that was inaugurated, bullet train was in news. So that is why there was a debate and a discussion about the requirement of swift mobility system. So what is the role of that? It helps in population redistribution. So the pressure which is experienced in the urban areas, that gets distributed. And as a consequence of that, the population, or it also leads to economic progress and growth in the other regions. Okay, faster movement, greater settlement, economic prosperity, all of that. Affordable housing, those can be brought into equation. Problem and prospects of inland water transport. All these areas are associated with the regions which are in current affairs. Discussion of current affairs. Those are the regions. Enumerate the problems and prospects of inland water transport in India. Inland water transport. Basically, what are the prospects, possibilities? Huge. 14,500 kilometers of navigable river systems that we have, perennial river systems that we have, canal systems that we have. Transportation can be eco friendly, can be cheap, it can be for logistical benefit or the benefit of the logistics in India. That is something that you can cite. Other than that, you can also talk about the role that it plays in lowering. We have talked about the lowering of the logistical cost, but also the aspect it can directly link to the coastal areas and the coastal ports. So the possibilities are huge. Then greater fuel utilization efficient. But the problems in the peninsular portion, seasonality, rocky terrain. In the northern portion, siltation, regular dredging, lack of infrastructure for the riverine ports. Okay, so those are your basic problems and prospects. Now for agriculture, generally in GS3 questions are asked. From being net food importer in 1960s, India has emerged as the net food by reason. Green revolution, horticultural growth, blue revolution, white revolution. These are to be mentioned. The various different revolutions, they need to be mentioned. Can the strategy of regional resource based manufacturing help promote or employment in this is associated with Gandhian ideology of Gram Swaraj. So, where each region will become self sufficient. So, thereby, regional resource based manufacturing that will be economically viable, that will be economically productive, will generate employment, and will also create unique products. It will lead to infrastructural development, and that is where industrial corridors can also be of greater. Okay, straightforward question. That was natural vegetation. This year, you can expect a question associated with the state of forest report. The findings of the state of forest report this year and next year also. Because straightforward questions are asked, examine the status of forest resources in India and its resultant impact on the climate change. Okay, so the water cycle and how the changing land use pattern brings about drought conditions. Identify and discuss the factors responsible for diversity of natural vegetation. Why do we have a variety of natural vegetation? Because of different physiography, we have changing rainfall pattern. And here you have to mention with each of the forest type, the amount of rainfall which is required. So that is basically from evergreen, semi-evergreen like that, you have to continue. Okay. This year, please go prepared for the portion of State of Forest report, which has been released recently. Despite India being one of the countries of Gondwana land, its mining industry contributes much less to the GDP in percentage. Here, it is asking you the reason that despite being abundant with minerals, why do we have such less contribution of mining industry in the reasons here are lack of infra, isn't it? We don't have infra connectivity in the regions which are mineral rich. Those areas are generally forested. So land acquisition is an issue. Acquisition is an issue. Then after that, you also have the issue associated with the case of the area of lack of technology. Efficiency is not there. Low efficiency. Okay. Lack of tech. Now, lack of tech in terms of what? Low level of exploration. Exploration. Now, upstream demand is not created in terms of feeder industries. Upstream demand is weak. Is weak. Now, low efficiency means cost is high. So, import is favorable in that. Okay. Now, after that, basically, you also have lack of clear policy. Policy. Okay. So, all these you have to infra in terms of connectivity, that is lacking. So, all these can mention. Okay. So, again, a 10 marker, 150 worded answer, simple question. Now, in terms of world, upstream industry, basically, for example, let's suppose iron. In the case of iron ore mines, now you have extracted iron ore. If you don't have enough capacity to generate steel, then much of that iron ore lies in the various dump yards, etc. So, if the demand is more, extraction will also be more. You have the eco-sensitive zones as well. For example, the Western Ghats, despite being abundant in iron, the iron ore mining is not carried out. Okay, role of mafias in the informal sector, all of that you can target. Right now, in terms of the world geography, resources based questions associated with current affairs are asked. This year again, please prepare the portion of EV industry, right? Where the sources in terms of where the minerals for EV, that is lithium, nickel, cobalt. Cobalt, DRC, nickel, Indonesia, and lithium in the ABC triangle that you have, the lithium triangle, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Australia, Kazakhstan, and the region of China, right? So, not Kazakhstan, but China, Australia, and ABC. These are the areas that you have to keep in mind, and the roadblocks in terms of the EV industry. Now, observe here the kind of questions describing the distribution of rubber producing countries indicate the major environmental issue faced by them. Now, this question would be the answer would be same had there been rather than rubber oil palm. The answer would have been absolutely. Now, rubber grows in which condition? In the regions of tropics, isn't it? That is where basically in the tropical region, higher temperature. So, where will it be found in India? Across the world. Tropics in Asia, in Africa, around the region of Equator, and in South America, in these areas itself. Right? Just mention the regions. Even if you are not sure about the exact location of industries, mention the regions. Okay? After that, here, indicate the major environmental issues. What are the environmental issues associated, let's suppose, with plantation cultivation? Because rubber is grown in a kind of a plantation manner. What are the environmental issues? Environmental issues, basically, this brings about monocropping. Monocropping leads to or is created by deforestation. Large areas are cleared in order to grow rubber, oil palm, etc. Lack of soil fertility reduces. Then moisture balance worsens, soil moisture worsens. Then biodiversity gets impacted. Why? Because the variety of vegetation that you have in natural forest, that is not. Okay? So this same answer would be required if a question of oil palm would be in the regions. Indonesia, Malaysia, these are the areas where you will find both rubber and oil. Right? Now, another area. Multi-dimensional implication of uneven distribution of mineral oil in the world. Look at another question. Petroleum refineries are not necessarily located closer to crude oil producing area. Now, in both these, it is associated with mineral oil. Now, when we talk about oil, which are the oil rich regions of the world? One is the area of Russia, then in North America, US, then comes western part of US, then Latin America, Venezuela, the region of northern part of South America, northern part of Africa, then Central Asia across the region of Caspian, West Asia. These are the regions which are rich in oil, eastern part of Russia. Now, there is an uneven distribution. What does that lead to? That leads to economic prosperity in certain areas. That also leads to greater geopolitical conflict, what is known as the curves of resources. This acts particularly in the regions like Venezuela. This also can lead to a kind of supply chain gaps or disruptions which can be created by the cartelization of OPEC nations. It can also lead to, first of all, talk about the positive aspects. Prosperity in these areas, economic growth happens, the upliftment of the population can happen, opportunities are created, etc. Then the negative, increased dependence on trade routes in certain regions. Other negative, greater geopolitical blackmailing, the portion that we talked about in today's CNA, right? Newspaper analysis. Greater geopolitical importance. So those can be talked about. Okay. So that is the case of multidimensional implication. Also, environmental degradation in these areas, oil spills, etc. They also become very. Account for the present location of iron and steel industries away from the raw material by giving examples. This question is a simple question which talks about that iron and steel industry, it is a weight gaining or weight losing industry. It is a weight losing industry. Now, this weight losing industry, where should it be situated? Weight losing industries generally are situated closer to raw material, to save the material cost or the transportation cost. Now, earlier, when you talk about steel plants like, let's suppose, Durgapur, Bokaro, Rourkela, situated very close to the region where coal, iron ore, limestone, etc., would be found to save on the transportation. But now, you have places which are far away. For example, in Dubai, you have the Jebel Ali, right? Even in Japan, you have the steel industries which are situated away from the source of raw material. Why? In order to ensure they are able to meet the flexible requirements of the industry, market demand, and at the same time, aided by faster and efficient mode of transportation. faster and efficient mode of transportation, availability of infrastructure like electricity. These are some of the reasons why they are situated away. Okay? Earlier they were situated close. Now, petroleum refineries are not necessarily located near the crude oil producing areas, particularly in many of the developing countries. For example, Panipat, oil refinery, Mathura, oil refinery, Baroni, oil refinery. Now, these are situated away from the crude oil regions, right? So, these are what are also referred as the off field refinery or the market refinery. These are closer to market so that it can also lead to the development of allied industry. It can serve the requirement of or the demand can be catered to easily, and multiple products can have usage in the development of other small and medium scale industries. It can serve as the input and the raw material. Now, implications: job creation, settlements, townships, and also pollution, environmental. Okay. So this is how you have to prepare, and these are the areas that you have to focus upon, even in the case of resources. Keep a track of current affairs is what I would advise. So this marks the end of the discussion for the entirety of the past 10 years of questions from the mains examination for the subject of geography. I hope we have not only managed to understand what is required to be written, we have also managed to understand which areas to focus upon. And when we appear for the examination this year or the next, we are better prepared to handle the variety of questions that UPSC tends to throw at. I hope the session has been helpful and has enriched your content and provided perspective. If you have benefited out of that, put that in the comment section and don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.